Dr. Alina Voss had been reviewing the morning's genetic panel results for 47 minutes when the door to her office at Hartwell Children's Medical Center opened, and a nurse leaned in to tell her that a walk-in consultation had arrived in exam room 4. That alone was unusual. Walk-ins didn't come to the Department of Pediatric Genetics. You made an appointment. You waited 6 weeks. You came prepared with your family history and your insurance cards and your fear already organized into something manageable. The fact that someone had simply walked in and been routed to her floor meant either the front desk had made an error or someone had used a name they shouldn't have. I set down the panel results. I straightened my coat. The badge on my lapel read Dr. Alina Voss, MD, PhD, Director of Clinical Pediatric Genetics, Hartwell Children's Medical Center. I had earned every letter of that title across 19 years of work that had largely happened in rooms where no one who shared my blood was watching. I walked down the hall toward exam room 4 and paused at the small window in the door before I went in. She was sitting with her back to me, but I knew her by the way she held her shoulders, tight and elevated, a posture I had grown up watching across kitchen tables and holiday dinners. The posture of a woman who had never once doubted that she deserved to be wherever she happened to be sitting. Her name was on the intake form, Diane Mercer, my sister. And she had absolutely no idea that the specialist she had been urgently referred to was me. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but as I stood in the hallway with my hand resting on the door handle, I understood that the time had finally arrived. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. I mean that genuinely. Because what I'm about to tell you took me nearly 2 decades to be able to say out loud, and I think some of you will recognize pieces of it that you haven't found words for yet. To understand what that moment in the hallway meant, I have to take you back. 22 years back. To a kitchen table in Meridian Falls, Ohio, where I was 24 years old and my family was deciding, loudly and without much ceremony, that my future was not worth investing in. My father, Robert Voss, was not a cruel man. I want to be careful about that, because the story is easier to tell if I make him a villain, but the truth is more complicated and therefore more useful. He was a practical man who had grown up without money and had organized his entire emotional life around the fear of losing what little he had eventually accumulated. The house in Meridian Falls. The small hardware business. The savings account that he checked every Sunday morning, the way other men checked the weather. My mother, Patricia Voss, deferred to him on financial matters, with a consistency that I used to mistake for agreement and later understood was its own kind of exhaustion. And then there was Diane. Diane was 3 years older than me and had understood from an early age that our father responded to confidence the way sunflowers respond to light. She was not smarter than me. I say that not out of bitterness, but because it is a fact I spent years of my life proving in controlled conditions. She was not more capable, but she was louder about her certainty, and in the economy of our household, certainty was the currency that bought everything. I had just finished my undergraduate degree at Harwick State University, biology, with honors, a fact that was mentioned at the graduation ceremony, and then never again. I had been accepted to the combined MD-PhD program at Karsten University School of Medicine. The program was fully accredited, nationally ranked in the top 20 for research output, and it was going to cost, beyond what my partial scholarship covered, approximately $34,000 over the first 2 years before I qualified for the research fellowship that would carry me the rest of the way. I asked my parents for help with that gap. The conversation happened on a Tuesday in late August. I remember the light in the kitchen. I remember that my mother was rinsing dishes at the sink and never turned around. My father sat at the table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, which was what he did when he was preparing to say something that he considered reasonable. Alina, he said, I want you to explain to me what a pediatric genetics doctor actually does, in plain language. I explained it. I told him about chromosomal analysis, about identifying hereditary conditions early enough to intervene, about the families who came to specialists like the ones I wanted to become because their children were sick in ways that no one could yet name. I told him about the research component, that I wouldn't just be treating patients, I would be contributing to the body of knowledge that made better treatment possible. He listened. He nodded twice. Then he said, "That sounds like a very expensive way to help a very small number of people." Diane was leaning in the doorway behind me. I heard her shift her weight. "Dad's right," she said. "I mean, how many families even need that? Most kids are fine, and you'd be, what, 40 before you even started earning real money?" 32, I said, if the timeline goes as projected. "That's a guess," Diane said. "A lot can go wrong." My father took his glasses off entirely. "We've worked very hard for what we have, Eleanor. I'm not going to put $34,000 into something that might not work out. That's not fair to the rest of this family." My mother turned off the faucet. She didn't turn around. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What about Diane's boutique? You put $47,000 into that." The room went very quiet. "That's different," my father said. "Diane has a business plan. The boutique had been open for 8 months. It would close 14 months later. But that evening, it was a business plan and I was an expensive guess." I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. I was not crying, which surprised me. I felt instead a kind of cold clarification. The way the air feels after a storm has finally passed, and you can see how far the damage actually extends. I understood something that evening that I had suspected for years, but had not been willing to name. My family was not going to help me build what I needed to build. They were not withholding support because of a cash flow problem. They were withholding it because they did not believe, at a fundamental level, that I was worth the investment. That was useful information. I went to my desk. I took out a notepad, and I wrote down the name of the research fellowship at Karsten University, the Dr. Amara Osai Fellowship in Pediatric Genomics, and I folded the paper and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. I want to be honest about the first attempts because the version of this story I was tempted to tell makes it look cleaner than it was. The truth is that the first year of the MD-PhD program nearly ended me. Not academically. I was performing well in my coursework, consistently in the top quartile of my cohort, and my research thesis proposal had been accepted with only minor revisions. What nearly ended me was the money. I had taken out federal loans to cover what I could. I had found a part-time position as a lab monitor for the undergraduate biology department at Karsten, which paid $11.4 an hour and allowed me to eat. I had a studio apartment 7 blocks from campus that cost $580 a month and had a radiator that worked intermittently and windows that did not seal properly against the Ohio winter. I wore my coat indoors from November through February for 2 consecutive years. In March of my first year, I received a letter informing me that the partial scholarship I had been awarded, $12,000 annually, was under review due to a departmental funding restructuring. The review would take 60 to 90 days. During that period, the disbursement would be paused. I sat with that letter for approximately 10 minutes. Then I called the financial aid office at Karsten and spent 47 minutes on hold before speaking to an administrator who told me there was nothing to be done until the review concluded. I went to the office of Dr. Miriam Cho, who was at that time an associate professor of human genetics at Karsten and the faculty advisor for my thesis. She was not my assigned advisor. I had gone to her because she had given a lecture in my first semester on the ethics of genetic disclosure that had made me stay in my seat for 10 minutes after the other students had left, just thinking. I told her about the funding gap. I told her that I could not cover the shortfall out of my lab monitor salary. I told her that I did not have family support available. Dr. Cho listened without interrupting. Then she said, "How much time do you have before the next tuition installment?" "10 days," I said. She opened her desk drawer, took out a form, and handed it to me. "This is the application for the Departmental Emergency Bridge Grant. It's not well publicized because the fund is small and we try to reserve it for situations like yours. The maximum disbursement is $4,500. Fill this out today and I will expedite the review." 19 days later, $4,200 appeared in my student account. I paid my tuition installment. I paid February's rent 3 weeks late and absorbed the $60 late fee. I kept going. What Dr. Cho did not say, and what I only learned later, was that she had personally advocated for my application during the review committee meeting. She had described my thesis proposal as, in her words, the most methodologically rigorous work I have seen from a first-year student in 11 years of advising. I learned this from another faculty member, not from her. I called my mother that spring to tell her the fellowship review had resolved in my favor and that I was on track. My mother said that was good news, and then told me that Diane's boutique was having a difficult quarter and asked whether I might be able to contribute something to help with the family's cash position that summer. I was 25 years old, living in a studio apartment with a broken radiator, wearing my coat indoors. I said I would see what I could do. I never sent anything. And I never mentioned it again. That was the first time I understood that silence was not a failure of communication. Sometimes silence is the most strategic thing you can do. The Karsten University MD-PhD program ran 7 years. I will not describe all 7 because this is not a curriculum transcript, it is a story. But I want to give you the shape of it because the shape matters. In my 3rd year, I joined the Vanthorpe Laboratory for Pediatric Genomic Research at Karsten, under the supervision of Dr. Raymond Solis, who was at that time one of 9 researchers in the United States with a dedicated focus on copy number variation in early childhood neurological development. Dr. Solis was not warm in the way that Dr. Cho was warm. He was demanding in a way that I initially found disorienting and later came to understand as respect in its most concentrated form. He expected from you exactly what he expected from himself: precision, rigor, and the honesty to say you did not know something when you did not know it. 6 months into my rotation in his lab, he called me into his office and told me that my analysis of a 6-patient case cluster had identified a recurring microdeletion on chromosome 15 that he had been trying to characterize for 2 years. He said, "You saw it because you were looking in the right place. I want you to know that is not luck, that is method." That was the whole of the praise. I went back to my bench and continued working. I completed my PhD dissertation, Phenotypic Expression of Submicroscopic Chromosomal Imbalances in Pediatric Populations, a multi-site cohort analysis, in June, 4 years after I had entered the program. I defended before a committee of 5 faculty members, including Dr. Cho and Dr. Solis, in a room on the 4th floor of the Karsten Life Sciences building on a Thursday afternoon. The defense lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. The committee deliberated for 11 minutes. They passed me with distinction. I was 29 years old. I folded my coat over my arm and walked out of that building into the late afternoon light, and I did not call anyone. I want to be specific about that. I did not call my mother. I did not call Diane. I had my phone in my hand and I stood on the steps of the Karsten Life Sciences building, and I thought about calling, and I put the phone back in my pocket. They had not funded this. They had not believed in it. The accomplishment was mine in a way that felt, at that moment, absolute, and I was going to protect that absoluteness for as long as I needed to. I went back to my apartment and made pasta with the ingredients I had on hand. I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for 8 months. I sat at my kitchen table alone and thought about the next step. The next step was residency in pediatrics at Morrow Belfield University Hospital in Cincinnati, a 4-year program that had accepted me to their combined clinical research track. During residency, I handled medical records for hundreds of pediatric cases, processed insurance policy documentation for families navigating health insurance coverage questions, and learned how brutally complicated it was for parents to fight for specialist appointment access for their children when the diagnostic codes were ambiguous. I saw families denied coverage for genetic testing that I knew, clinically, could change the trajectory of their child's treatment. I watched parents fill out the same forms 3 and 4 times, appeal after appeal, while their children waited. That experience shaped the kind of physician I became. Not the kind who operated at the level of elegance and theory, but the kind who understood that medicine happens inside a system, and that understanding the system was not optional. I completed residency in 2011. I was 33 years old. I took a fellowship position in clinical genetics at Hartwell Children's Medical Center in Cleveland, a 2-year fellowship that was funded by a grant I had co-written with Dr. Solis, who had by then moved to a senior research position at Hartwell. The fellowship grant was $67,000 annually, the most money I had ever had access to at one time, and I remember standing in a pharmacy in January of 2012 and being briefly astonished that I could pay for my prescriptions and my groceries in the same trip without calculating which one to defer. It was during the fellowship that I met Dr. Nathaniel Ademi. He was, at that time, the Associate Director of Clinical Operations at Hartwell, a tall, methodical man from Lagos, by way of Johns Hopkins, who had the rare ability to move between the clinical and administrative sides of a hospital without losing fluency in either. We were introduced at a departmental meeting and discovered within 10 minutes that we had overlapping research interests in the area of preimplantation genetic diagnosis. We began collaborating on a case review series. The collaboration became a friendship. Became, over the following decade, the person inside Hartwell who most completely understood both what I had built professionally and what it had cost me personally to build it. He was also the only colleague who knew about my family. Not everything. I did not tell anyone everything until I had to, but enough. He knew that I had no family support. He knew that my path through training had been financially precarious. He knew that I had not told my family where I worked or what I had become. "Why haven't you told them?" he asked me once in his office, eating a takeout lunch we had ordered during a long review session. "Because telling them would give them something they don't deserve yet," I said. He considered that for a moment. "Yet," he repeated. "Yet," I confirmed. That was 2013. I had been at Hartwell for 2 years. In January of 2015, I was appointed Director of Clinical Pediatric Genetics at Hartwell Children's Medical Center, the position I still held on the morning my sister walked through the door of exam room 4. The appointment was announced in the hospital's internal newsletter, in the Ohio Medical Association's quarterly bulletin, and in a brief profile published in the Karsten University Alumni magazine that spring. My family did not read any of those publications. I received a card from Dr. Cho, written in her small, even handwriting. I knew in the first week. "Congratulations, Eleanor." I kept it in the top drawer of my desk at Hartwell, underneath the copy of my appointment letter, where I could see it when I opened the drawer. I had been director for nearly 3 years when my phone rang one evening in November of 2017 with a call from a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a woman who identified herself as Karen Whitfield, a paralegal at Stanton and Reese Family Law Associates in Meridian Falls, Ohio. She said she was calling regarding the estate of Robert Voss, my father, the man who had sat at the kitchen table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and told me I was an expensive guess. She said that his health had been declining. She said that there were questions about the will that the family was beginning to discuss. She said she was reaching out to all parties who might have an interest in the estate proceedings and asked that I return her call at my earliest convenience. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter. I stood very still for a moment. I thought about the paper I had folded and put in my wallet 22 years earlier. I thought about the $34,000 that had never been offered. I thought about Diane leaning in the doorway with her certainty, and about my mother rinsing dishes with her back turned. I thought about the genetic panel results sitting on my desk at Hartwell, the routine screenings, the careful, irrefutable science. I did not call Karen Whitfield back that evening. I needed to think first, and I needed to understand, before anything else happened, exactly what I was walking into. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but I was a scientist. I did not move before the data was complete. The call from Karen Whitfield sat in my voicemail for 4 days. I listened to it twice more during that time, not because I needed to hear it again, but because I wanted to understand the specific wording she had chosen. She had said parties who might have an interest. Not heirs, not family members, parties with an interest. That was a paralegal being careful with language, which meant that someone in that office was already being careful about something. On the 5th day, I called her back from my office at Hartwell, with the door closed and my calendar blocked for the rest of the afternoon. She told me that my father had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 14 months earlier. She told me that his condition had been managed at Meridian Falls General Hospital and that he was currently in a stable but declining state. She told me that my sister Diane had recently come to Stanton and Reese with concerns about the structure of the existing will and had requested a formal review of the estate documents. What specifically concerned her? I asked. Karen Whitfield paused for exactly 1 beat too long. Ms. Mercer felt that the current distribution reflected circumstances that had changed over time and that an updated arrangement would more accurately reflect the family's current situation. I understood. Diane had found out about the will and she didn't like what it said, or she had found out what it said and decided she could do better with a revision. "Thank you, Ms. Whitfield," I said. "I'll be in touch." I sat for a moment after the call ended. Through the glass partition of my office, I could see the hallway of the pediatric genetics department, two nurses moving between rooms, a family sitting together near the consultation area, a resident studying a chart at the nursing station. All of it familiar. All of it built from work that had happened entirely without my family's knowledge or investment. My father was dying, I felt that. I want to be honest about that, because the easier version of this story lets me be purely strategic. And the truth is that I sat in my office for approximately 15 minutes doing nothing at all except understanding that my father, the man who had sat at the kitchen table and called me an expensive guess, was dying, and that I was not going to make it to Meridian Falls in time for any kind of genuine reconciliation. Then I picked up my phone and called Nathaniel. Nathaniel Adami met me for coffee the following morning at the small cafe on the ground floor of Hartwell's East Wing, the one we had been using for working breakfasts for the better part of a decade. He listened to everything without interrupting, which was characteristic of him. He stirred his coffee twice. He set the spoon down. "What does the will say currently?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "I haven't seen it. I didn't know my father had updated it." "But you think Diane has seen it?" "I think Diane has done something that caused her to go see a family law attorney at Stanton and Reese, which is not a firm you engage if you're satisfied with the existing arrangement." Nathaniel looked at his coffee. "Are you going back to Meridian Falls?" "I'm going to see my father, yes. Before the estate situation resolves itself one way or another, I want to see him. And the rest of it? I'm going to talk to someone first," I said. "Someone I should have talked to years ago." That afternoon, I called the office of Margaret Okonkwo at the firm of Okonkwo, Reyes and Park, an estate attorney I had been referred to 3 years earlier by the Hartwell Legal Department during a routine matter involving a patient's guardianship, and had not forgot. She had impressed me with her precision and her complete absence of unnecessary drama, qualities I valued in professionals more than almost anything else. I explained my situation in general terms. She asked 7 questions, each one more specific than the last. At the end of the call, she said, "Come in Thursday, bring whatever documentation you have access to, we'll figure out what you're actually dealing with." I went to see my father the following weekend. He was at home in Meridian Falls, in the bedroom at the back of the house where the light came in through the curtains in the afternoon. He was smaller than I remembered. People say that about the dying, and it sounds like a cliché until you are standing in the doorway looking at someone you have known your entire life, and understanding that the architecture of them has changed, that some essential structural element has quietly been removed. He knew who I was. He was alert, some days more than others. I sat next to his bed for 2 hours on Saturday and another 90 minutes on Sunday. We did not discuss the will. We did not discuss Diane. We talked about things that existed before all of it: a fishing trip he had taken me on when I was 7, a dog we had owned briefly, the particular blue of the kitchen walls in the first house he and my mother had owned before Meridian Falls. On Sunday afternoon, before I left, he held my hand for a moment and said, "I know you turned out fine, Eleanor." I told him I had. I told him I was happy at my work. He nodded and closed his eyes. I drove back to Cleveland that evening and did not let myself think about it until I was inside my apartment with the door closed. What I had not told him, and what Karen Whitfield at Stanton and Reese did not yet know, was that I had already spoken with Margaret Okonkwo and had already begun the process of formally establishing my standing as a beneficiary in the estate proceedings. Margaret had reviewed what documentation I could access and had identified 2 things of significance. First, that my father's existing will predated Diane's recent consultation with Stanton and Reese by several years, which meant any changes she was pursuing were not yet formalized. And second, that the estate included a property in Meridian Falls, the hardware store building, now leased to a commercial tenant, that had appreciated significantly since my father had acquired it and represented the most substantial single asset in the estate. Margaret had also told me something else. She had told me to make sure I had documentation of my own financial and professional standing before the estate review formalized, because it was not uncommon for family members disputing a will to attempt to characterize other beneficiaries as absent, estranged, or otherwise less deserving of consideration. She was not telling me to do anything I hadn't already been considering. She was simply confirming that my instincts were sound. I had already begun gathering what I needed. Medical records from my years of training, not patient files but professional records. My appointment letter from Hartwell. My academic credentials. The grant documentation from the fellowship that Dr. Solis and I had written together. And something else, something I had in my briefcase from a case I had been working on, something that would become relevant in a way I had not yet anticipated. Margaret had also flagged a piece of the estate conversation that I had not yet had to think about directly. My sister had mentioned, in her initial consultation with Stanton and Reese, that there were family circumstances that bore on the inheritance question. She had not been specific, but the phrase family circumstances, in the context of an estate dispute, Margaret told me, was language she had encountered before. It usually meant someone was about to make a claim that extended beyond the existing will. I did not know yet what Diane meant. But I called Margaret that evening after I returned from Meridian Falls. I signed the first document establishing her formal representation of my interests in the estate proceedings. There was no going back. My father passed away on a Thursday in early February 2018. It was quiet, as such things sometimes are. He simply stopped, early in the morning, while my mother was sitting with him. I received the call at 6:47 in the morning before my first patient consultation. I sat in my car, in the Hartwell parking garage, for 12 minutes. Then I went inside and saw my patients, because they were children whose families had been waiting for weeks, and the news I had to give them had nothing to do with my grief and everything to do with their survival. I arranged leave for the following week to return to Meridian Falls for the funeral. I told Nathaniel. He offered to come. I told him it was not necessary but that I appreciated it, and that I would call him when it was done. In the 2 weeks between my father's death and the funeral, Diane called me 3 times. The first call was to tell me that my father had passed, which she would have known I already knew since my mother had been the one to call me. The second was to ask about my travel arrangements, ostensibly to coordinate. The third was the call I want to describe carefully, because it was the moment I understood with complete certainty what the next phase of this was going to look like. She called on a Tuesday evening. I was in my kitchen reviewing documentation that Margaret had sent over, a financial disclosure request she had filed with Stanton and Reese on my behalf, asking for a full accounting of the estate assets. Diane did not know about Margaret. As far as my sister was aware, I was a physician somewhere in Cleveland who had been largely absent from the family's life for 2 decades and had not retained legal representation. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice had a particular quality to it, not quite warmth but the performance of warmth, the way someone speaks when they are being recorded and want to sound reasonable. "I think we need to have an honest conversation about the estate before the funeral." "All right," I said. "Dad had specific wishes," she said. "I know he didn't always make things easy for you and I know you've been distant. But I've been here, Eleanor. I've been the one managing his care, managing Mom's needs, dealing with the house. That has to count for something when we're talking about how things get divided." I kept my hands flat on the counter. I looked at the financial disclosure document in front of me, at Margaret's name and the Okonkwo, Rays and Park letterhead. "I understand," I said. "I just want you to go in with realistic expectations," Diane said. "I don't want there to be any conflict at the funeral." "Dad wouldn't have wanted that." "Neither would I said. "I appreciate you being upfront about it." She exhaled, a small, satisfied sound. She thought she had accomplished something. "Good," she said. "I'll see you next week." After I hung up, I sat for a moment. She had been managing his care, she had said. She had been there. These were real things, I did not dispute them, and I did not intend to diminish them in any proceeding. But managing someone's care in the final 14 months of their life, and being named the sole beneficiary of a commercial property worth approximately $340,000 in a revised will that had been drafted 3 months earlier were two different things. And the space between those two things was exactly where Margaret Okonkwo was currently working. Within 24 hours of that call, Margaret had filed a formal objection to the revised will on the grounds of undue influence, citing the timeline of the revisions relative to my father's medical condition at the time of signing. The estate attorney was going to have to respond. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The funeral was held at St. Catherine's Parish in Meridian Falls on a Saturday morning in February. It was cold in the specific and unrelenting way that Ohio in February is cold, and the church was full. My father had been a known figure in that town for 40 years, and people came because he had been decent to them in the ordinary transactions of daily life, which is not nothing. I sat with my mother in the front row. Diane sat next to her. I had not seen Diane in person for 7 years, and time had done the things to her face that it does to all of us. But the posture was unchanged, the elevated shoulders, the particular set of her jaw that communicated entitlement, the way a flag communicates nationality. She embraced me in the vestibule before the service began. She said it was good to see me. I told her the same. I meant neither thing and I suspect she didn't either, and we were both fine with that. The service was appropriate. The priest said the things priests say. A neighbor of my father's named Gerald Purcell gave a short remembrance that was genuinely moving about my father's habit of fixing things for people in the neighborhood without being asked. I thought about the kitchen table. I thought about the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. It was at the reception afterward, held at the Meridian Falls Community Hall, adjacent to the church, that Diane made her move. I had been anticipating it, but I had not anticipated the specificity of it. That was my error. I had assumed she would wait until the formal estate proceedings. I had not expected her to do it here, in front of approximately 60 people who had gathered to mark my father's passing. I was standing near the window with a cup of coffee when she came to stand beside me. She had someone with her, a man I did not recognize, mid-40s in a dark suit. She introduced him as Philip Hartley, the attorney from Stanton and Reese who had been handling the estate review. Bringing her attorney to a funeral reception was not a choice that reflected good judgment, but Diane had never been primarily motivated by judgment. She was motivated by certainty. "Eleanor," she said, "Philip is here because I thought it would be cleaner to address the estate questions directly rather than let them drag out through channels." I looked at Philip Hartley. He had the expression of a man who had advised his client against exactly this and had been overruled. "All right," I said. "Dad's son," Diane said. "Thomas, my son. His child with someone he had a relationship with before he and Mom, it was complicated. But Thomas exists and he deserves to be recognized and he deserves his share of what Dad left behind. Half, that's what's fair. Thomas is entitled to half the inheritance." The room had not gone entirely quiet, but the conversation nearest to us had stilled. I was aware of people turning, awareness spreading outward from us like a ripple. I looked at Diane for a moment. I looked at Philip Hartley. He was looking at the floor. "Thomas," I said, "your son." "Dad's son," she said. "I can have a DNA test done, but I don't think it should have to come to that. He's family, he deserves." "I have the paternity results in my briefcase," I said. Diane stopped. "From a routine genetic screening I conducted last month," I said. "Thomas came to Hartwell Children's Medical Center as a pediatric specialist referral. The screening was standard. The paternity analysis was incidental, it was part of the full genomic panel. The results were finalized 4 days ago." The room was quiet now. Not completely, there were still conversations at the far end of the hall, a child somewhere near the refreshment table, but the immediate radius around us had gone entirely still. Diane's face had changed. Not collapsed, Diane was not someone who collapsed easily, but something had shifted in it, some internal scaffolding had moved. "You," she started. "I am the director of clinical pediatric genetics at Hartwell Children's Medical Center," I said. "I have been for 3 years. Before that, I completed a fellowship in clinical genetics at Hartwell, a pediatric residency at Morrow Belfield University Hospital, and a combined MD-PhD at Karst University, where I specialized in chromosomal analysis and pediatric genomic research. The results in my briefcase were generated by my department, reviewed by my team, and signed by me. I went to the table where I had set my briefcase when I arrived. I opened it. The results were in a folder, standard clinical documentation, printed on Hartwell letterhead, bearing the case number, the patient identifier, and my signature at the bottom. I took them out and I walked back to where Diane and Philip Hartley were standing. I handed them to Philip Hartley, because he was the attorney and it was the appropriate professional gesture. He read the first page. His expression did not change, which told me he had some capacity for self-control. He turned to the second page, then he looked up. "Ms. Mercer," he said quietly, and his voice had shifted register entirely, "I think we need to step outside." "What does it say?" Diane said. She had not moved. "The paternity analysis," I said, "indicates a 0% probability that the individual identified as Robert Voss is the biological father of the individual identified as Thomas Mercer." That was the first document. I had 3 more. The 3 more were not in my briefcase. They were in Margaret Okonkwo's office in Cleveland, filed that morning with the probate court. The first was the formal objection to the revised will. The second was a financial disclosure demand addressed to Philip Hartley's firm, requiring a full accounting of all estate assets and any transactions involving those assets in the 24 months prior to my father's death. The third was a petition filed under my name as a beneficiary of the original will, the will that had existed before Diane had walked into Stanton and Reese with her concerns about circumstances that had changed. I had not gone to Meridian Falls to start a fight. I want to be precise about that. I had gone because my father was dead, and I was his daughter, and there are things you do regardless of what came before them. But I had also gone prepared, because preparation was the single discipline that had carried me from a studio apartment with a broken radiator to the directorship of a pediatric genetics department, and I was not going to set it aside because the occasion called for grief. Philip Hartley guided Diane toward the side door of the community hall. She went without resistance, which surprised me. I had expected resistance. Perhaps she had understood something in that moment that she had not understood before. Perhaps seeing the Hartwell letterhead and reading the words Director of Clinical Pediatric Genetics had reorganized something for her in a way that was not yet fully processed. My mother appeared at my elbow. She was a small woman and she had grown smaller. She looked at the door that Diane and Philip Hartley had just gone through, and then she looked at me. "Eleanor," she said. "How long have you been?" She stopped. Started again. "The hospital, how long?" 3 years as director, I said. 19 years total if you count from the beginning. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were dry. She was 71 years old and she had been rinsing dishes with her back turned for decades, and I think she understood in that moment the full accounting of what that had cost. "I should have come to your graduation," she said. "Yes," I said, "you should have." We stood together for a moment. Then she took my arm, and we went to sit with the rest of the people who had come to remember my father. The estate proceedings resolved over the following 4 months. Margaret Okonkwo handled it with the precision and lack of drama I had expected from her. The revised will, drafted 3 months before my father's death, during a period when his medical records documented significant cognitive decline secondary to his cardiac condition, was successfully challenged on undue influence grounds. The original will, which divided the estate equally between Diane and myself, with a specific provision for my mother's continued care, was reinstated by the probate court. The commercial property was appraised at $338,000. After the legal settlement costs and the estate attorney fees were settled, my share came to approximately $142,000. I put $85,000 of it into a college fund for Thomas Mercer, my nephew, regardless of his paternity, because he was 11 years old and had no part in any of what had happened between the adults in his family. I established it through a financial advisor at Meridian Falls Savings and Trust, structured as a trust document in his name, with conditions I set and that Diane could not alter. I did not tell Diane I had done this for 3 months. When I told her, she did not say anything for a long time. The remaining $57,000 I put into my own retirement savings, where it joined the disciplined accumulation of nearly 2 decades of living carefully within my means. Diane and I did not speak for 8 months after the estate settled. When we finally spoke, it was because my mother had asked us to, and because I had decided that the accounting was complete, and I was not interested in continuing the silence past the point where it served a purpose. The conversation was not warm. It was not a reconciliation in any Hollywood sense. It was 2 adult women sitting across a table in a mediocre restaurant in Meridian Falls, Ohio, saying true things to each other for the first time in their shared memory. Diane told me she had been afraid that I would surpass her. I told her that I had surpassed her. She said she knew. I told her that it had cost me things I hadn't expected it to cost me. She said she was sorry, and I believed her, which surprised me. That was enough. It did not fix anything, but it was enough to close the door on the part of the story that required ongoing maintenance. At Hartwell, nothing changed. My colleagues knew what they knew, which was that I was the director of my department and that I had taken a week of personal leave in February. Nathaniel knew more. He asked me when I came back how I was doing. I told him the truth, which was that I was tired in a way that sleep did not entirely address, and that I expected it would pass. It did pass. It took about 4 months. There's a morning I think about sometimes when I am trying to locate the center of this whole long story. It was in the spring of 2018, about 2 months after my father's funeral. I was in my office at Hartwell, early, before 7, which was typical. I was reviewing a case file. The light was coming through the window in the particular way it does in Cleveland in April, tentative and then committed. My badge was on the desk next to my coffee cup. My appointment letter was in the top drawer. The card from Dr. Cho was still there, in her small, even handwriting. A resident knocked on my door to tell me that a family had arrived early for their specialist appointment, a couple and their 3-year-old daughter who had been referred to our department for evaluation of a suspected chromosomal abnormality. The mother had been awake for what the resident told me was probably 36 hours. The father was holding the little girl in the waiting area and reading her a book. I went out to meet them. I introduced myself. I said, "I'm Dr. Aliner Voss. I'm going to take care of your daughter." I have said versions of that sentence thousands of times. It does not become smaller with repetition. If anything, it becomes more precise. That is the work. That is what the whole long construction was for. Not the confrontation in the community hall, not the probate filing, not the $142,000 or the college fund, or the vindication of every choice I made at that kitchen table in Meridian Falls when I was 24 years old. All of that was true and all of it happened, but it was not the work. The work was in the waiting room, in April, with a family who needed someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I knew exactly what I was doing. That was the point. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The most powerful thing you can do when someone dismisses your ambition is to stop arguing and start building, because an argument ends in an evening and a career built in silence speaks for the rest of your life. 2. Documentation is not coldness. It is the language that institutions understand, and if you want the truth to be heard in the rooms where decisions are made, you must bring it in a form that cannot be denied. 3. Your identity is not a verdict delivered by the people who were supposed to believe in you. It is something you construct, credential by credential, patient by patient, year by year, in rooms they never entered and mornings they never saw. Was I wrong to never tell my family what I had become, to let them believe, for nearly 2 decades, that I was simply absent rather than building something they could not take from me? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.